Before we start, I would encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, just go to the link below. You'll be able to print a set of the sermon notes from that link. Also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker. You'll want to have some juice or wine. If you don't have juice or wine, probably anything to drink would work. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion. So if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video right now, get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So, Aristotle said that we have 5 basic senses. Can you name them? Well, of course you can. It's pretty easy. This isn't a difficult question. This isn't a trick question. The 5 basic senses are sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. Those are the 5 basic senses. Pretty easy, right? And I asked a question of the folks who attended the chapel services at Eastmont this week. I asked them which one of those 5 senses, and I forced them to choose one of those 5. I said, which one of those 5 senses would you never be willing to give up under any circumstances? And I gave them the choice of smell. And nobody raised their hand. And I said, what about your sense of taste? And nobody raised their hand. I said, well, what about the sense of hearing? And again, nobody raised their hand. I said, now what about the sense of touch? And there were a few people that raised their hand. And then I said, what about your sense of sight? And just about everybody raised their hand. So that was very interesting. At Eastmont this week, when I asked the residents there, they said that if they had to give up some of those senses, which was the one, though, that they would never be willing to give up by an overwhelming majority, they said that their vision was the one sense that they would never be willing to give up. And of course, those of us who have our vision, it's easy to take that for granted. I read that 70% of our brain function is tied to our vision. That is an incredible amount of our brain function that is tied to that one sense out of our 5 senses. And of course, you are already anticipating that the reason that I'm talking about these senses, and the sense of sight particularly, is because we're about to take a look at a lectionary gospel reading in which Jesus encounters a blind man. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the reading. This is John chapter 9, verses 1 through 39, and it is a slightly abridged reading of this passage. Starting with John chapter 9, verse 1. As Jesus was traveling, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. After this, Jesus spit on the ground and made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, No, he only looks like him. But he himself said, I am the man. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. Now on the day in which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Some of the Pharisees said, This man Jesus is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, How can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, He is a prophet. I was blind, but now I see. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, You were steeped in sin at birth, and they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, and when he found the man, he said, Do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me, so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Jesus said, For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. May God bless the reading of the powerful and the fascinating Word. So this is a powerful passage, and it's a fascinating passage because in some ways this passage should be fairly straightforward. In some ways, this should be a passage where Jesus encounters a blind man, he heals him, and that's the end of the story. That is the happy ending. And yet, as you can see from reading this, there was a controversy that came up, and discussions and arguments and misunderstandings. And so what I'd like to do right now is what we always do. Let's talk through the passage. Let's try to understand why this ended up being far more complicated than it probably needed to be. And then after we talk through the passage and try to understand why it was so complicated, then let's talk about 3 of the misconceptions that they had back in Jesus' day, misconceptions that I think we still have, at least to some extent, even in the year 2026. In fact, I'm going to refer to them as traps that many of us fall into. So, at the very beginning of the passage, it says that Jesus was traveling, sees this man who was blind from birth. So this man has never had his sight. Can you imagine what life would have been like for someone who never had their sight? And the disciples have a question for Jesus. Now, it seems to me that if I was one of the disciples and we came to a man who had been blind his entire life, the question that I would have asked Jesus is, Jesus, can you see him? Can you help him? Can we help him? Is there anything that we can do to help this man? But that wasn't the question the disciples had for Jesus. Instead, the question that they asked Jesus is, who is it that sinned? Was it this man? Which makes no sense at all. Why would God cause him to be blind from the time he's born for a sin that he would commit later on? That makes no sense whatsoever. Or his parents. And again, that doesn't make much sense to me either, because if the parents had committed some sort of sin, why would God cause their child to be born blind? But that is the serious question that the disciples asked Jesus. And we're going to talk more in a few minutes about why they would have even asked that question in the first place. Now, Jesus' response, as you would expect, is neither. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. And it says that after that, Jesus did something very interesting. It says that he spat on the ground and that he reached down and that he stirred up the dirt with his saliva and he made mud. And if you're thinking gross, I agree with you. That sounds really gross. But that's what he did. And we'll talk more about why he may have done that specifically in a few minutes as well. But then he picks up the mud and he puts it on the blind man's eyes. And he tells him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. So now this blind man is going to have to go on a trek. And he's probably going to have some of his friends or someone help him to the pool of Siloam, because it's doubtful that he could have made it there by himself being blind. So it says that he went, that he washed the mud off, and that he came home seeing. And I want you to think for just a moment about what that must have been like for someone who has never had his sight his entire life. And now suddenly he can see everything. Can you even try to wrap your head around the ability now to see people, the ability to see nature, and how it would have been for this man to try to process all of those things? It must have been just absolutely incredible. And so he comes home and he's a completely different person, as you would imagine. And it says that he is such a different person that when he comes home, some of his neighbors and some of the people that knew him, they were arguing with each other about, is that him? No, there's no way that's him. Yeah, that's definitely him. And he's saying, it's me. It really is. It's me. And so it tells us that at that point, they take him to the religious leaders. They take him to the Pharisees. And here's the issue. The issue is that rather than celebrating the fact that this man who'd been blind his entire life now has his vision, rather than celebrating with him, the religious leaders have a problem. And the problem is that he was healed on the Sabbath, and you were not supposed to, quote unquote, work on the Sabbath. And as far as they were concerned, both Jesus and the blind man had, quote unquote, worked on the Sabbath. And I think it's no coincidence that Jesus did all of the things that he did and asked the blind man to do all of the things that he did because Jesus was trying to force the issue. If Jesus had wanted to simply heal this blind man, he simply could have said, "You are healed." He, in fact, didn't have to say anything for that matter. He could have just healed him without a word. You know that. I know that. But this healing is very different than many of the other miracles of healing that Jesus performed in the Gospels. This is the only one where he spits on the ground and makes clay from the spit in the dirt. And this is one of the only miracles where the person has to perform a chore before the miracle takes place. In this case, he had to go all the way to the pool of Siloam and wash off the mud. And again, this would have been considered work on the part of the blind man because you had a limited number of steps that you were allowed to take on the Sabbath before the steps that you took were considered working. He's got to wash off the mud. That would have been considered working as well. When Jesus spat on the ground and he made the clay and he put it on the man's eyes, for Jesus, that would have been considered working. So Jesus, it would certainly appear, has gone out of his way to make sure that he's working and that the blind man is working in order to accomplish this miracle. Because I think that Jesus wanted to force these Pharisees to have a discussion about whether this was right or wrong, whether their concerns about keeping the Sabbath were correct or incorrect, whether they were problematic or whether they were being legalistic. So there's that. Now, it tells us that the Pharisees argued with each other, and some of them said, this man Jesus is not from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath. So they're being legalistic. No, he can't be from God. He doesn't honor the Sabbath. And the others said, that's ridiculous. How could a sinner, as you call Jesus, perform such incredible, miraculous signs? And so they are divided. And so then they turn to the blind man and they said, well, what do you think? And I love the blind man's response. He says, I think he's a prophet, which was a major thing for him to say. He says, look, I was blind. Now I can see. Which kind of reminds me of the lines to a pretty famous hymn. And then he says, look, if this man Jesus wasn't from God, he couldn't have done these things. And of course, we know he's right about that. And look at the Pharisees' response. They get mad. And they say, you were steeped in sin and birth, and they threw him out. Now, I told you we'd talk about this as well. So just like at the very beginning of the passage, when the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned? Now it's the Pharisees who are saying, well, the reason that you were blind is because of sin in the first place. And so we have to also look at the fact that in this biblical world that Jesus lived in 2,000 years ago, that they believed that if good things happened to you, that God was rewarding you. If bad things happened to you, God was punishing you. And Jesus absolutely tried to correct that here with the disciples. He says, look, neither this man nor his parents sinned. We'll come back, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But after this, Jesus goes and he finds the man and he says to him, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, we've talked about this before. Anytime you see that three-word phrase, Son of Man, what you're supposed to think to yourself is Son of Man equals Messiah. That's right. And so he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe in the Messiah? And the blind man says, "Who is he? Tell me, and I'll believe in him." And Jesus says, "You have now seen him." No pun intended. He's the one speaking with you. And the man says, "Lord, I believe and worship Jesus." And Jesus at the end of the passage says, "I came into the world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." And I'm pretty sure that last line was a reference to the Pharisees, who were continuing in their legalism to say that Jesus was not from God and this was a bad thing, when of course this was an incredible, a powerful, and a beautiful thing that happened. So, what I want to do now, fairly quickly, is I want us to talk about 3 of the misconceptions that they had back in biblical times, and I want to talk about the fact that even in the year 2026, I think that we continue to carry on these misconceptions to some degree, and I'm going to refer to these as traps that we still fall into in this day and age. And the first trap is this: causality. In other words, believing everything that happens is either a reward or a punishment from God. Again, trap number 1, causality. Believing everything that happens is either a reward or a punishment from God. Because that's what they believed 2,000 years ago. That's why the disciples asked the question. That's why the Pharisees made the scornful statement that they did. They believed that if someone was born blind, it was because either they or someone else had done something wrong and they deserved it. On the other hand, if someone was healthy, then God was rewarding them. If someone was poor, God was punishing them. If someone was wealthy, God was rewarding them. To you and me, that sounds pretty backwards in its thinking, but to them, that was how the world worked. And Jesus certainly tried to clear up those misconceptions. And he said, at least to the disciples in this passage, look, that's not what happened here. But we also know that in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said to the disciples that God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and God sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, Jesus was saying, look, sometimes good things happen to bad people, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. That's just how the world works. And we can say, well, yeah, I get that. I'm not falling into the trap of causality. And I hope that that's true for most of us, and yet I think that many of us at times will look at something that happens in our life and we'll say, oh, well, God rewarded me. We circled the parking lot a couple times and then all of a sudden a car pulled out of the stall right in front. We pulled right into it. Hey, God gave me a little reward there as I got that perfect parking spot after circling the lot a couple of times. And I know that that's kind of a facetious example, but I do think that a lot of us at times, and a lot of Christians that I've known, have certainly wanted to chalk everything that happens up to God rewarding us or God punishing us. And that simply isn't true. Jesus said very clearly in the Gospels that that is not always what's happening. Now, to be clear, I do think that there are times when God rewards us. No doubt. And that's a good thing. And I also think that there are times when God corrects us. And sometimes that's a little painful. But it isn't like every little thing that happens to you and to me is God rewarding us or God punishing us. Sometimes life just happens. The sun shines on us. The rain falls on us, like Jesus talked about. Sometimes those things just happen. And so let's not fall into the trap of causality. That is the first trap we want to avoid. The second trap is legalism, excessively following the letter of the law. And look, in this passage, you obviously know that the Pharisees, at least some of them, were not able to get out of this trap of legalism. Something powerful and amazing and beautiful had happened, and yet they refused to acknowledge that it was a beautiful thing. Instead, they said that it was a bad thing because it just happened to be between sundown on Friday and sundown on Saturday when Jesus performed this miracle. That's the Sabbath, by the way, as far as the Hebrew people were concerned 2,000 years ago and still today. Between sundown on Friday and sundown on Saturday, that's the Sabbath. And that's when Jesus apparently performed this miracle. And so for at least some of the Pharisees, this was a bad thing because they were legalistic. And I will say this. Are there still people of faith who are legalistic today? Yes, there are. Are there Christians who are still legalistic today? Yes, there are. When I was younger, I will be the first to tell you that I was more legalistic than I wish I would have been as I look back. And I am trying to be much less legalistic the older I get. But there are still moments when I catch myself being legalistic as well. And Jesus came to force the issue of the legalism. That's why Jesus performed this miracle the way that he did. He was trying to force the Pharisees to take a difficult look at their legalism. Some of them realized that they were being legalistic, and some of them refused to acknowledge it. We need to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of legalism. That's the second. I'm getting short on time. The third trap is this, the trap of argument. In other words, debating with people instead of simply explaining what God's done in our lives. Look, if social media has taught us anything over the past 15 years, it's that we can argue with literally anybody on the face of the planet about literally anything. And the funny thing is we may feel like we've won an argument. Even when you feel like you've won an argument with somebody, how often have you changed their mind? Not very often, right? Because even when we feel like we've won an argument, all that typically does is make the other person mad, and they just, if anything, they get more entrenched in whatever position they were in before. In this passage, when they came to the blind man and they said, what do you think? We can't settle this amongst ourselves. He said, all I can tell you is this. I was blind, and now I see. And the great thing about that is you can't debate that, can you? You can't argue that. Look, you and I can debate theology and philosophy and everything else. But when I tell you how God has changed my life for the better, when you tell other people how God has changed your life for the better, they can't argue with that, can they? And that's what we should do. Let's not get sucked into arguments and debates. Instead, let's just tell people how God has changed our lives for the better. And that leads into the final thing for us to prayerfully consider. This man's testimony was simple. I was blind, but now I see. What is your testimony, and how often do you share it? And the video is going to cut me off here in just a minute, but I want to at least start communion, and then you can go ahead and finish communion on your own. I want to grab my communion elements, and I'm going to invite you, as I start to partake of my elements, to partake of your communion elements as well. The body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him, and the blood of Christ, shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray. God, we thank you for this incredible miracle.